Today, Kumi Naidoo will provide a perspective on growing global efforts to address climate change, and he'll challenge the Australian perception that little is currently being done as an argument for inaction. Kumi Naidoo was part of the successful struggle against apartheid in his native South Africa, an activist and a Rhodes Scholar before joining Greenpeace. For 10 years, he was the General Secretary of Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation. He was appointed by the UN Secretary-General to the Eminent Persons Group on United Nations Civil Society Relations. Today, he sits on the board of Greenpeace Africa and chairs the Global Campaign for Climate Action. He was one of the founders of Global Call to Action Against Poverty, which has grown since 2005 into a coalition of anti-poverty campaigners from over 100 countries. And the organisation applies public pressure on leaders to fulfil promises on aid, trade, debt, climate change and gender equity, all topics that we have tackled in one way or another here also at the Institute. Kumi's main campaign priorities at Greenpeace include creating a world where CO2 emissions are under control, tropical rainforests are protected, and dirty fossil fuel energy is replaced with renewables and energy efficiency. This is his fourth visit to Australia. Please join me in very warmly welcoming Kumi Naidoo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me start by saying I'm pleased to see so many of you here. As a young 22-year-old, when I fled into exile to the UK, I was asked to go and address a think tank, like we are here. And I pitched up and on the time that I was to speak, and there was only one person in the audience. And after 15 minutes, I said, maybe we can just go have a coffee and talk about things. And the person said, no, I made a real effort to come here, please give your speech. 30 minutes later, the person dutifully clapped and then said, okay, bye-bye. He said, no, you've got to stay and listen to me. I'm the other speaker that was invited to speak. In the early 1980s, there was a slogan that said, think globally, act locally. What was behind that slogan was that irrespective of the issues that we were trying to tackle at the local or national level, we needed to think more deeply and thoughtfully about how global processes, global institutions, and global discourse had an impact on what we could or could not achieve at the national level. However, one of the ironies of the moment of history that we are living in, precisely at a time when many countries, including my own South Africa, the successor states of the former Soviet Union, various Latin American countries that were coming out of military dictatorships in the early 1990s, were securing democracy for the first time, or after a long time, real power was shifting from the national to the global levels. So today, when we try to address any national issue, we need to think deeply about how global processes and global thinking and global power shapes what we can and cannot achieve at the national level, but also what we should and should not do if we want to ensure that every country in the world exercise responsible leadership and stewardship for future generations. The reality is that we are living in a unique moment of history. Some have called it a perfect storm, others have called it a boiling point. Essentially, it refers to a convergence of different crises that are coming together in a very concentrated moment of time. For example, we had the fuel price crisis a couple of years, which led to a food price crisis with food riots in about 60 countries. As we sit here, we have a poverty crisis that takes the lives of close to 50,000 men, women, and children every single day in developing countries from preventable causes. And of course, we have the climate crisis, which according to Kofi Annan's foundation in 2008, already we can show around 300,000 lives are being lost and rising as a result of climate impacts. Sadly, it was only when we had the financial crisis that our political leaders actually stood up in a sort of global collective and said, actually we have a crisis, we must do something. But the response to the crisis has had two problems. One, largely what our leaders sought to do through the G20, which Australia is part of, was to put a massive band-aid over the problem and hope it'll go away, and it's not going away. And secondly, we saw a clinging to a business as usual approach and trying to get away with the most minuscule levels of change that is needed to adapt to a vastly changed global reality. What is that changed global reality? Let me put it to you in an anecdote. Copenhagen, December 2009. The climate negotiations. The European Union, which has been a leading part of the world in terms of environmental legislation and on climate change specifically, had come there with a 20% reduction target by 2020, when the science actually says that we should be aiming in rich countries to go for a reduction target by 2020 of between 25 and 40%, but they add 10% in the back pocket, and they're hoping, depending how the negotiation goes, they might put that 10% on. The negotiations were stuck, and this I can't verify with 100% certainty, but I heard it from two people, but I'll tell you as a piece of juicy gossip. The leaders of India, South Africa, Brazil, and China were meeting in a caucus session, and apparently at one point a gentleman knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I'm Barack Obama, the President of the United States, can I join you?" And basically, those five countries actually made the deal. The European Union was completely shut out from engagement, and in fact, when Angela Merkel, who led the European Union delegation, called a press conference to give the European Union's response, everybody waited for close to 2 hours and they couldn't agree a response, and that press conference didn't happen. The bottom line is we are seeing a power shift happen in the world, and we are seeing the ascendancy of certain countries which in the past were simply dismissed as developing countries, but are now have a new sexier title called emerging countries. Seriously, it's not that sexy, but what is true is that the whole power dynamic in the world has actually shifted considerably in the last couple of years. Where does Australia find itself in this? Firstly, to its credit, Australia can say, we weathered the financial crisis. Okay, good. But it continues to have a dependency on a range of old ways of thinking and doing business by clinging on to a dependency and an addiction to fossil fuels, particularly coal. And I understand actually today, the head of the Australian Coal Association, I believe almost at the same time, is speaking at the National Press Club in Canberra. And I would like to send a gentle challenge to him to actually say, he has to ask himself, and the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry has to ask themselves, whether in fact they will take the responsibility of the collapse of the Australian economy 10 to 20 years from now, when the demand for coal around the world will certainly decrease. Will the Coal Association in Australia take responsibility for the fact that, in fact, the statistics that Martine gave about public opinions in Australia changing, for the manipulation of the public debate in terms of the disproportionate influence that the fossil fuel industry exercises over the political process in Australia, in Canada, and in the United States in particular. Just to give you a little bit distance, think about the United States. The United States today is the best legislature that fossil fuel money can buy. If you look at every single member of Congress as 3 full-time lobbyists that are on them, putting pressure on them to ensure that in fact no climate legislation goes forward. The United States is about 4% of the world's population, but is responsible still in excess for 20% of emissions. Now, you might feel a little bit happy about that statistic because Australia is responsible for 1.5% of the world's emissions at the moment. But when you look at your population size and per capita, you are certainly right up there in the top 10. And from developed countries, Australia is the highest emitter. This idea that Australia, by passing progressive climate legislation, will be acting alone and will be getting ahead of the curve is one of the most amazing fallacies I've ever heard in a long time. I actually didn't quite get this until I arrived here a few days ago, that was how it was being played out. The reality is that when you have a dependency of 80% of your electricity needs coming from coal, that means you are behind the times. If you have an emissions target by 2020 of 5%, not on 1990 levels, which the science calls for, but on 2000 levels, you are behind the curve. But most importantly, what the current fossil fuel lobby in this country is pushing for is taking you down a dead-end economic route. Let me give you a small anecdote from a meeting with the chief climate negotiator of China, who's also the vice minister of planning. And any of you are familiar with communist systems, the Ministry of Planning is the big dudes. I walked out of that meeting. It was a lobbying meeting to go and push the Chinese government to act more decisively on climate change. When we walked out, there were two impressions I had. One, the Chinese leadership were extremely concerned about the impacts of climate change in China. Southwest China already has a massive climate-induced drought, and various other parts of China are suffering massive flooding, which you must have seen from time to time. So they want to ensure that they actually address it. But the other side of it is that the Chinese leadership, which has shown that they are much better at capitalism than virtually every other capitalist society in the world in the last 20 years, have decided that, in fact, investing in renewable technologies now seriously is what's going to actually consolidate their economic dominance in the future. In the first quarter of 2010, China surpassed every other country in the world as the biggest investor in renewable technology. We in Greenpeace are calling for an energy revolution. By an energy revolution, we say we need to do two sets of things. On the one hand, we're saying we need to look at energy efficiency, because part of the problem globally is a lot of energy that is generated is actually wasted through a whole range of different ways. We have to become more energy efficient, and in addressing energy efficiency, there might actually be a whole range of job creation potential. For example, if we say that every building in Sydney needs to be refurbished so that they are energy efficient, that has the potential to create a range of jobs in the construction sector, but it means that we have to be willing to also invest in human resources and reskill people in a range of skills. On the other hand, the other track is investing seriously in renewable energies. The thing that puzzles me is that Australia has been blessed with abundant potential in renewable energy. Solar, wind, wave, geothermal, biomass. You have a range of potential to turn Australia into one of the leading renewable energy countries in the world. It will be good for the environment generally, good for climate specifically, but also it will be good for the economy. We can show, as a whole range of other independent think tanks have also shown, that the job creation potential in the renewable energy sector is significantly more than in the fossil fuel sector. Now, of course, I just want to say, on the China question, I don't want to paint too a rosy picture, because while on the one hand, every hour now, a wind turbine is coming on stream in China. Every single hour, a new wind turbine is coming on stream. On the other side, every couple of weeks, coal-fired power plant is still coming on stream. Okay, so you got competing sort of trends, but the Chinese and most other countries are beginning to understand that the writing is in the wall, that time is running out, and so on. Now, the thing that also puzzles me about Australia is that I know people say that Australia is a land of fire and floods, but when we look at Australia from far away and we see some of the weather events that you've actually had, we think that the wake-up call is there, and that in fact, sadly, that if things continue as it is, you ain't seen nothing yet. It will get much, much worse. Agriculture will be impacted on in fundamental ways, and I have to say that I am deeply concerned to hear of basically the government enabling the sale of rich farmlands in Australia to companies from outside of Australia for mining purposes. And once that happens, you can't get that back for agriculture. Also, when we look at what's happening in Kimberley on the a vast and unique wilderness, and when we look at the idea of creating a gas hub, which might totally devastate a unique environment, I understand the last savanna forest of its type in the world, you're actually risking certain real precious natural assets for short-term investments, which actually ultimately will destroy Australia's overall asset base when we look at the ecological limits that we have to live within. Now, the big elephant in the room in this conversation about climate change, which I think most of us, and when I say most of us, I mean people in government, business, civil society, people in rich countries, poor countries, are not willing to actually address, and that is, if we are to deliver the quality of life that people say in Australia enjoy, and the elites in developing countries enjoy, then we are talking about, and we say that it's only fair that if folks in Australia have it, and if the rich people in developing countries have it, really everybody should have it. We're talking about at least 5 planets. So we have to also address the issue of consumption. We cannot dodge it, and we also have to begin to ask the question about what kind of sustainable society that we need for the future. And yeah, I want to say that it's really critical that we deconstruct this whole climate change debate and bring it down to basics. This fight is about securing the future of our children and grandchildren. For those of us in the developing world, one of the things that's quite painful for us is that even though folks in developing countries have been least responsible for the emissions, we are the ones that are paying the first and the most brutal price. People actually now in some organizations talk about the need for a climate debt for the impact that is happening, for example, in Bangladesh, where already sea level rise is actually creating a range of large numbers of climate refugees. And yeah, when you look at Australia, and I have to say that personally, I'm quite disappointed at how Australia has handled the immigration policies and practices over the recent times. But if you think you've got an immigration problem now, with heightening sea level rise, that problem will be multiplied several times over. So if you want, if policymakers think immigration needs to be kept under control and so on, addressing climate change is actually, in part, addressing the issue of immigration management. But the other impact of climate change is that of leading to serious conflict, but also full-scale war. I jokingly say, I've been waiting all my life to start a sentence like the sentence I'm about to start, which goes like this. I strongly support the Pentagon and the CIA when they say, as they said in 2004, in a report that the Bush administration suppressed, that in fact the biggest threat to future peace and security is going to come from climate change. And they talked in 2004 of the next 20 years where they said millions of lives will be lost, resource wars will start, and so on and so forth. But when we talk about resource wars, let's be very clear, the resource wars have started already. I'm sure most of you have heard of the genocide in Darfur. That genocide has been presented more as an ethnic conflict. When you look deeply at what it is all about, it is driven by water scarcity and land scarcity. We have the Sahel region, which stretches from Senegal to Sudan, which every year the desert is marching by 1 mile southwards, which is reducing the amount of land for growing food. And then we got Lake Chad, one of the largest inland seas in the world, which, as in the words of the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, has shrunk to the size of a pond. So when we have these kinds of realities, we need to recognize resource wars are not only something that's going to happen in the future, they are with us right now. Achim Steiner, the head of the United Nations Environment Program, has pointed out that, and I quote, "It illustrates and demonstrates what is increasingly becoming a global concern. It doesn't take a genius to work out that as the desert moves southwards, there is a physical limit to ecological systems, what ecological systems can sustain, and so you can get one group displacing another." So when we look at climate change today, we have to recognize that it is not an environmental problem, it is not an economic problem, it's not a peace problem, it is a combination of all these problems. And I would like to then conclude with this thought. We have to begin to address the different challenges that humanity faces in a much more integrated and holistic way. Part of the problem in the past is that we put global problems in different silos or boxes and try to address each of them separately. We had an environment box, a poverty box, a peace and security box, and so on. We have to recognize that all of these issues are fundamentally interlinked. And if at all we are to be able to address any one of those problems, we have to do it together. So we cannot say to developing countries, you don't have the right to develop because it'll be more emissions. But we should also say to the developing countries, as Greenpeace is saying, you don't have to bury your head in the ground and say, we didn't create the problem, so therefore it's not our issue, when in fact your people are paying the first price. What we should be doing is learning from the mistakes of Western-driven development that we've seen, which has got us in the mess that we are in, and develop new ways, clean ways of generating energy and meeting our energy needs to drive our economy, and rethink the way we understand consumption, the way we think about the gap between the rich and poor, and how much, because part of our problem is that the gap between the rich and poor in every single country and between rich and poor countries is growing at an astronomical and unsustainable pace. So I'd like to end and take questions. I don't want to talk for any much longer because I'd like to have more time for questions. I'd like to end with the words of Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "This planet has enough to meet all of humanity's need, but not all of humanity's greed." We have a responsibility, this is my words now, sorry. We have a responsibility to future generations. And I want to say that the current leadership of our business community, our political community, and even other parts of society, we are failing not only future generations, but current generations. However, to end on an optimistic note, I believe it is within our grasp to rise to the challenge of leadership that this calls for, but it requires moral conscience, it requires political courage, and certainly it requires political will, not to go for small baby steps in the right direction, but to do what the urgency calls for, even if it brings with it some measure of pain. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Kumi, for a very rousing presentation. And we have about half an hour for you to engage with the audience, which is terrific. I might get the ball rolling by beginning, I guess, with your concluding observations about the importance of cooperative action between the various stovepipes of policy. We can say that I think there was a very strong prediction which came true that Copenhagen would not succeed. Copenhagen was going to be the great hope for international cooperation, and it really failed miserably, unless you can say that perhaps the BRICS cooperated effectively together. But my question is this. We keep on talking about international cooperation and coordination, and yet it is really, and we've been speaking about it for quite some time, and it has not really delivered for us in any way. Let me tie that to the point. You didn't mention population or population control. It seems to me that demography is a very important factor and element in this. And it strikes me that in terms of control of fertility and demographic predictions, maybe that's one area where some action might be taken where you can actually get common agreement among countries, developing and developed countries. Would you like to make a comment about that before I open it to the floor?
Yeah. Thank you. I knew the population question would come up. Firstly, just on the broader question of the quality of global governance, in a sense. I mean, part of the problem we have is that even though since the fall of the Berlin Wall, more and more power has actually gone upwards to supranational institutions. So today, not only environment and climate you cannot address as a national issue, you have to address it globally. It's, avian flu, HIV/AIDS, because even the pricing of life-saving pharmaceutical drugs happens at the global level, and any number of other issues today, peace, security, terrorism, all of these issues. But part of the problem we have is that the global governance system that we have is undemocratic. There are four deficits we have. One is we have a democratic deficit because, for example, to have a UN Security Council today that has China, US, France, UK, and Russia, that might have made sense in 1945 because, our whole global governance system is stuck in the geopolitics of 1945 when many of these institutions were actually formed. I mean, why should today Britain and France have a veto at the United Nations, on the United Nations Security Council? In 1945, you could have made an argument that because they were colonial hegemons controlling large populations, they had a right to have a seat. Today, the only reason they would need to be there is because they are possessors of weapons of mass destruction. But if you use that nuclear logic, then you have to add India, Pakistan, and so on. So we got a democratic deficit. The second problem we have is a compliance deficit, which is there are many good global decisions that are made, and you can see piles and piles of paper of UN and other UN bodies where when you look at it, like say the Beijing Summit on Women that took place in 1995, good stuff, the level of compliance, extremely bad, right? And that is thousands of examples. The other problem we got is a coherence deficit, which is the silo stuff. Every country is sending their foreign minister goes off to the UN, the finance minister goes off to the IMF World Bank, the environment minister goes off to UNEP, so there's a very large levels of incoherence. And then lastly, all those deficits contribute to a legitimacy deficit. So even if good global decisions come, many people at the national level can sometimes say, well, I don't feel quite represented by it. So we have to recognize that the global system has to be democratized, lots of work needs to be done on it. And when we look at Copenhagen, where you started your question, Martin, we went to Copenhagen asking for a FAB treaty. Not a fabulous treaty, but a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty. Instead, we got a FLAB outcome, which is full of loopholes and bull, right? And then, so we're in a logjam. And some people are beginning to speculate that Greenpeace has a lot of influence because the next climate negotiations takes place in my hometown in Durban. I want to just assure you, in the context of transparency, we had nothing to do with that. But now there's a low level of expectation, and part of our job is to pick up the level of expectation. Because that's what we need to do, and that's what the urgency calls for. But on the question of population specifically, there is a very simple solution to addressing the population problem. If you look, if you ask people, how do you address it? People say education and so on. But bottom line is, when people are lifted out of poverty, then in fact, family sizes generally come down. There are some exceptions in certain religious communities and so on, but generally, that is the trend. Now, if you're an African woman, firstly, many African women don't have control of their reproductive health, but sometimes even women will make a choice. Let me have 6 kids rather than 3, because I know that 3 might die, and I'm just hedging my bets, right? So it's a terrible tragedy, but this is the reality. But let me just flip the population question around a bit, because if you were to take an Australian-African comparison, for every one Australian and what the footprint of one Australian is, it's about 50 Africans' footprint, right? So what I would say, that when you look at the population question, because quite often people just see numbers, they don't see consumption. So I agree that we have to address the population question, but I think we have to be very careful not to come at it from a way that will pick up cultural sort of boundaries and barriers. We have to approach it from a positive, addressing poverty, improving the quality of life perspective, and because otherwise, as it's been shown historically, the population question can get riddled with all sorts of cultural assumptions and conflict, which actually holds back progress.
Yes, please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Anthony Hobley, I'm the Global Head of Climate Change at the international law firm Norton Rose. So the 2 questions are, I think, communications, and do we need to actually sell that positive message? And I guess, why is Australia taking a very different approach to the UK and not sort of seeing the opportunities, really worried about the risks? And just to throw into that, you talked about China. I mean, they're talking about making the green economy 15% of the entire Chinese economy within the next 5 years. I mean, the chairman of GE said that this is the biggest business opportunity of the 21st century. So can we play more on that, do you think? Will that get us more traction?
Excellent question, and I agree with the sentiments in both. On the first communication question, I think that the challenge we have there is, how do we be honest with people and tell them that the situation is really serious, right? We have to do that. But I agree with you, if we are presenting our communications and messages in a very dire kind of time has run out kind of way, then in fact people get, it almost becomes a disincentive for action, because people think, oh, what difference can I make? So I think part of the challenge is to actually talk about the possibility of what a green economy can bring. And that's why at the beginning I was saying, and maybe just to tell you a cartoon I saw in Copenhagen, there was a group of, it was a cartoon of a group of negotiators, biting the fingernails and saying, oh my God, what if the whole climate change thing is a whole hoax? And then on a PowerPoint it said, well, the benefits will be cleaner air, better water quality, longer life expectancy, blah, 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 blah. So I think we need to actually talk up all of the positive outputs. That's one. Then on why is it not happening in Australia, I think two reasons primarily. I think I see similarities actually between Australia, Canada, and US on this, and that is countries whose economies are heavily based on resources, and particularly on fossil fuel, oil, gas, and coal, tend to be more hesitant to make the change faster. And then it also means in those three countries, the level of influence on the political process of oil, coal, and gas interests are actually disproportionately high. And then also, in terms of public debate, you know, sometimes who controls the media and what your media mix is also has a big influence. So, you know, like in one of the three countries I mentioned, there's one individual who owns a lot of media, and he has a particular perspective on the issue, and it seems to me that he also has a pretty good relationship with some of the folks in the fossil fuel industry. And let's not kid ourselves that people are intelligent, people are not stupid, but if they are if they are bombarded on a daily basis with skepticism, half-truths, falsehoods, and so on, it is not surprising that actually what is patently true to the majority of people in the world can actually not penetrate. So we have to think also about communicating. And the last thing I would say is a criticism of organizations like Greenpeace and other environmental groups is that we also need to become better at talking in more simple ways. We use a lot of jargon. Like sometimes you'll rarely find me in public speeches talking about saving the climate or averting. I always say securing the future of our children and grandchildren. Just talking in those terms opens up the debate. Anybody who's a parent or grandparent suddenly feels, hey, this conversation is about me, let me try to enter it. But quite often, all of us actually talk in ways that exclude people from the conversation rather than include them.
To what extent does Greenpeace and the other organisations, to what extent do they get together? And to what extent does Greenpeace or any of the other organisations get into the lobbies, such as the oil industry, and begin to influence them?
Okay. I was going to give you a naughty answer to the last part of your question by saying 2 weeks ago I did try to get into the oil industry in the Arctic, and I got put in prison for 5 days. But the first part of let me just take the first part of the question is an excellent question, because again, I'm a very self-critical person, and I'm always challenging us in civil society, the campaigning organizations, to work better. Part of the problem is if we treat climate change as an environmental problem, we're not going anywhere. We have to understand that it's an intersectoral problem, and therefore Greenpeace was one of the founding organizations of the Global Campaign for Climate Action, known by the sort of thing tick, tick, tick. Some of you might have heard of it. And that includes WWF, the World Council of Churches, the International Trade Union Confederation. So it has faith groups, trade union groups, as well as not just environmental NGOs, but others. So, and I actually chair the board of the Global Campaign for Climate Action, and actually about at least 10% of my, if you calculate a working day on the basis of a 9 to 5, at least 10% of my time goes actually working on building alliances with others. So that's important. The second part of your question about getting access, we actually have a lot of access, and we have a range of high-level conversations with the folks in the corporate sector generally, and maybe I'll just answer it, tell it in a small, funny anecdote. I'd been going to the World Economic Forum at Davos for 10 years before. I started at Greenpeace as a human rights, gender equity, and anti-poverty campaigner. And when I used to go in that role, I would never get any CEO to sit down and have a proper structured meeting. Like, once I was desperate to lobby for 2 Ethiopian activists that were languishing in prison for more than 2 years. And there was a company that had good access to the political leadership in Ethiopia. Very difficult to get them to sit down and have a conversation. In fact, I used to do my best lobbying in the corridors, and in fact, my better lobbying in the men's toilet. I once lobbied Bill Clinton on signing the landmine treaty in the urinal next to me in Davos. This is a true story, by the way. But when I went for the first time as a head of Greenpeace, my schedule couldn't accommodate as many of the CEOs of big companies that wanted to meet with us. And we are very open. We've had the third largest retail company in the world, Metro, actually come with the entire senior management team, sit down with us at our offices and talk about where our differences were, why we had those differences, and they are shifting policies and so on. In any case, I asked one of the CEOs, why is it? I was just, I couldn't cope with the number of meetings when I went to Greenpeace last year and this year, and one of the CEOs said, you see, the reason many of these companies are so desperate to get Greenpeace to the table is that they are hoping that way they won't be on your menu. So listen, we are open, but specifically with the oil, coal, and gas companies and the nuclear companies, because we are opposed to them, and because, see, what we would say to those companies, transition your business model. You are energy companies. Take your skills, take your competencies, retool yourself, put your energy, put your capacity, your innovation, and so on into the renewable sector. And if you want help and support and access to some of the scientific knowledge that we have, we'd be happy to help them. And those are some of the conversations that take place. We are invited to the World Oil Congress, the World Energy Congress, and so on. And usually we are inside, and often we are also outside.
Yeah.
Meat consumption is one of the biggest contributor to climate change, to greenhouse gas emissions. And when we talk about 9 billion people, the 7 billion now we have nearly, we are growing animals to feed. There are more than 60 billion animals are slaughtered annually just for feeding people. So this is a emphasis wrongly placed. If there's more, and there are health issues, there are climate issues about that. So this aspect never gets, never gets mentioned, because that's how we can change ourselves, because we lobby the governments and all that, and that costs money. But by changing our own eating habits, we can change and contribute to this thing. And consumption and the wastage, the amount of wastage of food and other items, resources that is there is enormous.
Okay, no, I think that point is important. And if you look at New Zealand, for example, 50%, almost 50% of the emissions in New Zealand is actually from agriculture, because actually New Zealand has a very high level of renewable energy. I do definitely think that we all should be saying and doing more about how do we address the emissions that come from agriculture, because it is a significant chunk of global emissions. I think the idea of people reducing meat consumption is a good thing. I think that I'm being challenged by my young daughter to go 100%, and I'm working on it. But I do think that it's also already happening, and I will just agree with you on the point that that is one of the strategies that can make a difference. But I want to say something about religion. What was the name of the organization you said?
This is Australian Research Response to Climate Change, the multi-state.
Okay, great. So just on a lighter note, I was in Rome recently, and given that I was on a TV show, and because the Vatican was nearby, and the folks, there's a lot of religious discourse around issues like environment and so on, and I was like sort of saying, do people really think that God is such a cruel person? Because God knew that humanity will need energy, so God decided, okay, I'll put the coal deep in the ground, I'll put the oil deep in the ground. I'll put the gas and the oil deep in the ocean, so people kill themselves getting to it, and in the course of it destroy other things that God created. Clearly, humanity has been looking in the wrong direction. Rather than looking down, we should have been looking up to the sun and the wind. And and as we at Greenpeace, I jokingly said on the 3rd month anniversary of Fukushima, when I was addressing some rallies in Tokyo, I said, there is one reactor that I fully support. And all my Greenpeace Japan colleagues were looking at me, what is he going to say? I said, no, this reactor has unlimited amount of fuel. It's far away from us. It doesn't have any waste left behind, and it's the sun. And so thank you for raising that question, and I'd like to grab your card before I leave, because I'd like to keep in touch.
I'm Christian Lelon from BHP Billiton.
Thank you for coming.
And I wanted to ask you about your expectations for Durban, and more generally the UN process for a globally binding treaty. When you see the position of countries like the US, Canada, Saudi Arabia, it's difficult to see how that process is going to lead to a binding treaty. On the other hand, you see countries like China who are indeed taking action and investing heavily in solar and wind. So how do you see the process playing out at the global level and at the national level?
The Minister of Environment of South Africa in Cancun said, we should make sure that Durban is not another endless, just another, endless round of negotiation. Durban should be a destination, not just another stopping point. Now that's, I would say, I would love that to be the reality of what we can achieve in Durban. But as you correctly say, that the stars are not aligned because of the positions taken by some of those countries you mentioned. However, we must not forget that the Kyoto Protocol went ahead without the United States and without everybody signing up at the same time. And in Bali, I don't know if those of you who are following the climate negotiations, 4 years ago in Bali, President Bush's delegation was blocking any movement, and then the delegate from Papua New Guinea got up, made an emotional plea and said, listen, if the United States doesn't want to get with the program, please step aside and let the rest of us move forward. And I think the United States right now is a mixture of what's happening, because if you take high-level public opinion, I'm not talking about mass opinion, like the key policy, like take Thomas Friedman, for example, the well-known New York Times columnist. He says, forget about the arms race, forget about the space race. The only race that will matter for the future is the green race. And he speaks about it very personally. He says, I have 2 daughters, and our government in the US, by holding back the climate negotiations, is destroying the future of my 2 kids. Right? So, and then there's also bottom-up pressure in the US, where many states have set Kyoto-type targets and are moving in it. I spent an entire day in Los Angeles in February, met with every single member of the Los Angeles City Council, the Los Angeles, second largest city in the US, and we are pushing them. They've already made some good commitments. We were trying to push them to actually fast-track phasing out of coal much faster, and we got a positive response. So we are struggling as Greenpeace, in our colleagues in Greenpeace US, pushing on coal and other fossil fuels is a priority. And I don't want to be over-optimistic. Things are very difficult. I think Durban, if it can shift us as close to a fair, ambitious, and binding treaty as possible, that would be great. I think we should definitely get movement on money, meaning, to help countries with adaptation. I think we'll get substantial more progress on forests in terms of REDD+. But the question is whether we can, and I genuinely hope that we can protect Kyoto, and that, because the Kyoto second period commitment has to be consolidated. If we have anything, if Kyoto collapses, I think the world will be in an absolute, the conflict between rich and poor nations, if Kyoto collapses, will be something like we've never seen before. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Even if we don't get a FAB treaty, there's a possibility that we could actually we can build on the progress, modest progress that was made in Cancun, and take it, a good couple of steps forward. And thank you for coming.
Please join me in thanking very warmly our speaker, Kumi Naidoo.